Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, guten Abend. Mein Name ist Thomas Wallach und ich darf Sie im Rahmen des Bildungsvereins Offene Gesellschaft sehr herzlich zur heutigen Ausgabe von Talk Europe begrüßen. Diese Veranstaltungsreihe hat in den letzten Wochen und Monaten Schlagzeilen gemacht, aber es ist nicht das ihre eigentliche Qualität, sondern der Grund, warum sie das getan hat. Jede einzelne Veranstaltung von Talk Europe hat eine öffentliche Debatte angestoßen, die immer kontrovers und immer konstruktiv war. Und es steht zu hoffen, dass das auch heute so bleiben kann. Und auch für unsere letzte Veranstaltung, denn das ist heute schon die vorletzte. Die letzte ist dann mit Chantal Mouffe am 4. Mai, also schon in Kürze. Jetzt will ich aber die Vorfreude auf heute auch gar nicht mehr länger hinauszögern. Ich möchte Ihnen noch den Moderator des heutigen Abends vorstellen. Er ist einer der bekanntesten Philosophen Österreichs und ganz sicher der kontroversiellste. Herzlich willkommen, vielen Dank, Robert Pfaller.
Ja, vielen Dank, Michael Wallach. Schönen guten Abend, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren. Wir haben heute eine sehr interessante Runde zu einem sehr brisanten Problem, wie Sie gleich sehen werden. Meine Gäste heute Abend sind Professor Renée Schroeder, die Präsidentin der Politischen Akademie, Bildungsverein Offene Gesellschaft. Bitte, Renée Schroeder. Und unser Hauptvortragender heute Abend ist Professor Frank Furedi, University of Kent, Cambridge. Please, Frank. Ja, das Thema des Vortrags von Frank Furedi heute Abend lautet Taking Democracy and the Aspirations for Solidarity Seriously, the Challenge for Europe. Das ist ein hervorragender Vorschlag gewesen, der wunderbar in das Programm passt, das ich mir ausgedacht habe. Besser vielleicht sogar noch als das, was ich Frank Furedi eigentlich zugedacht hatte. Ich war nämlich fasziniert vor allem von seinem Buch über die Universitäten. Was ist mit unseren Universitäten geschehen? Wie hat die Infantilisierung an den Universitäten Einzug genommen? Das ist das letzte Buch von Frank Furedi, das ich kenne, und das hat mich außerordentlich beeindruckt. Dort hat Frank Furedi die Frage gestellt, warum vor allem an englischen und amerikanischen Universitäten die Studierenden nicht mehr sagen zueinander, ich stimme mit deinem Argument nicht überein aus diesen und diesen Gründen, sondern einfach nur noch sagen, was du da gerade gesagt hast, verletzt meine persönlichen Gefühle als irgendeine Identität ethnischer oder sexueller Art. Das hat Frank Furedi dort meisterhaft untersucht und hat die sozioökonomischen Hintergründe dieser Veränderung sehr gut beleuchtet. Darum habe ich ihn ursprünglich eingeladen, weil ich mir dachte, dass Bildungspolitik einer der heiklen Punkte ist, über die man sprechen muss, weil das auch einer der Gründe ist, warum Menschen in Europa großen Zorn auf die EU empfinden, denn die EU hat in der Bildungspolitik massiv eingegriffen und eine massive Verschlechterung der Studien- und Lehrbedingungen an den Universitäten hervorgerufen und eigentlich die Universitäten als das zerstört, was sie eigentlich sein sollten. Das war ein Grund, warum ich an Frank Furedi sofort gedacht habe, weil das auch insgesamt dem Anspruch dieser Vortragsreihe entspricht, dass wir hier versuchen, über die Themen zu sprechen, die man ansprechen muss, über die Punkte, an denen Zorn entsteht und über die man nachdenken muss, weil sonst dieser Zorn eine Beute der politischen Rechten wird. Das war der Ausgangspunkt. Und darum hatte ich, um das kurz in Erinnerung zu rufen, Theoretiker eingeladen wie William Mitchell und Thomas Fazi, die dieses Problem auf der Ebene der politischen Ökonomie und auf der Ebene der Politik gestellt haben. Die Frage der Währungssouveränität und der politischen Souveränität und der Erhaltung von Demokratie. Dann hatte ich den Philosophen Slavoj Žižek, der grundsätzlich nachgedacht hatte über die Bedingungen politischer Veränderung und welche Institutionen dazu notwendig sind. Letzte Woche hatten wir den sehr interessanten und aufregenden Vortrag von Catherine Millet, der französischen Kuratorin und Schriftstellerin, die über die Diktatur des Gefühlten gesprochen hat und die Frage, warum es eine Propaganda gibt, die sozusagen das Gefühl zur Norm des Sozialen macht, also so wie man halt was empfindet, das ist sozusagen die Wahrheit dessen, was da stattgefunden hat, die unhintergehbar scheint. Das hat sie sehr gut analysiert an zum Beispiel den Fragen von MeToo und anderen brisanten Debatten. Und nächste Woche haben wir noch Chantal Mouffe, die seit längerem nachdenkt über Postdemokratie und Fragen der Entdemokratisierung. Frank Furedi hat aber nicht nur den Vorzug, dass er in den vielen Veröffentlichungen, die man auch gut im Internet nachlesen kann oder auf YouTube sich anhören kann, zu den verschiedensten brisanten Punkten Stellung genommen hat, nicht nur zur Bildungspolitik. Er hat auch den Vorzug, dass er zeigt, wie diese Probleme zusammenhängen. Und das ist, glaube ich, ein ganz entscheidender Vorzug, den wir heute Abend erleben werden. Ich glaube, man kann sagen, dass eigentlich von der Bildungspolitik zum heutigen Thema ein sehr signifikanter Übergang besteht. Viele Menschen in Europa haben sich gefragt, was da eigentlich passiert ist bei dieser Bologna-Reform, die unsere Universitäten in einer Weise verändert haben, dass jede Form von interner demokratischer Mitbestimmung in einem Maß ausradiert worden ist, das noch ärger ist als die Universität, die wir Anfang der 70er Jahre in Österreich noch hatten. Das muss man sich mal vorstellen. Also Universitäten sind heute weniger demokratisch als diese hierarchischen Universitäten, die das glorreiche Universitätsgesetz von 1975 abgeschafft hat. Und an dieser Veränderung sind alle maßgebenden politischen Kräfte in Österreich mitschuld gewesen. Das ist nicht nur ein Erfolg der jetzigen Regierungsparteien gewesen, das muss man auch ganz klar sagen. Diese Entdemokratisierung der Universitäten hat auch selber auf eine sehr antidemokratische Weise stattgefunden. Der deutsche Soziologe Hauke Brunkhorst hat einen wunderschönen Aufsatz dazu geschrieben, den Sie im Internet finden können, dessen Titel lautet, es ist ein Zitat von dem deutschen Maler Sigmar Polke und heißt "Höhere Wesen befahlen". Ja, das ist der Titel eines Bildes von Sigmar Polke, "Höhere Wesen befahlen, rechte obere Ecke schwarz malen", so heißt der Titel des Bildes. Und Brunkhorst hat das sehr gut nachgezeichnet, wie das eigentlich dazu gekommen ist, dass in Europa plötzlich diese Bologna-Reform durchgesetzt wurde. Da haben Leute in der EU-Kommission, die nicht dafür verantwortlich waren, einen Vorschlag gemacht, für den sie nicht kompetent und befugt waren. Und dieser Vorschlag ist wie ein Befehl absalutiert worden von den nationalen Regierungen, die das dann beschlossen haben. Und diesen Vorgang hat Brunkhorst sehr gut nachgezeichnet. Und ich glaube, an diesen beiden Punkten kann man schon sehen, wo hier in der EU ein berechtigtes Unbehagen entstanden ist an Vorgängen der Entdemokratisierung und wieso immer mehr Menschen das Gefühl haben, dass sie eigentlich ständig Entwicklungen zusehen müssen, bei denen sie nicht gefragt worden sind und zu denen sie nicht zugestimmt haben. Das kann man ja auch in größerem Maßstab bei verschiedenen anderen Vorgängen gut beobachten. Man konnte sich ja als Beobachter auch vor einigen Jahren fragen, warum war das eigentlich nicht möglich, dass die Beschlüsse der griechischen Bevölkerung respektiert wurden und warum konnte Griechenland mit seiner Finanzkrise nicht so umgehen wie zum Beispiel Island, dass der Staat gesagt hat, wir haften nicht für die Banken und die Banker sperren wir jetzt ein. Das hätte ja dort auch passieren können, aber das ist von eigenartigen Gremien, die wir alle nicht gewählt haben, verhindert worden, dieser ominösen Troika und diesem eigenartigen Zusammenschluss von Finanzministern, der auch keine demokratische Legitimierung hatte. Das sind die, glaube ich, brisanten Punkte, über die wir heute sprechen müssen. So führt der Weg von der Frage der Bildungspolitik zu der Frage am Demokratiemangel in Europa. Und das ist das Thema von Frank Furedi heute Abend. Ich stelle Ihnen aber auch unsere Respondentin gleich jetzt vor. Professor Renée Schroeder, es freut mich sehr, dass Sie gekommen sind und sich bereit gefunden haben, hier heute als sozusagen Antwortgeberin oder als zweite Impulsgeberin unserer Diskussion hier zu fungieren. Renée Schroeder ist in Österreich außerordentlich bekannt, die berühmteste Biochemikerin des Landes, aber auch durch ihre schönen Buchpublikationen, von denen ich nur zwei nennen möchte, von Menschen, Zellen und Waschmaschinen, ein Titel, der einem Lautréamont Ehre gemacht hätte, glaube ich, Anstiftung zur Rettung der Welt. Dieses Buch ist 2014 erschienen und 2016 dann die Erfindung des Menschen, wie wir die Evolution überlisten. Dieses Buch ist 2017 dann zum Wissenschaftsbuch des Jahres gekürt worden. Ja? Das sind meine illustren Gäste heute Abend. Frank, now the floor is yours. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you for inviting me. Just to begin on a personal note, in one sense I'm very, very lucky because all my life I had some very interesting and positive political experiences from which I could learn quite a few things, not always learning the right lessons, but nevertheless, sort of have memories that, in a sense, guide me towards trying to find out those answers. When I was 9, I lived through the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, which for me was an experience that I'll never forget, because I could see people, ordinary people, who a month before would walk around like robots, being very, very scared, and looking at their shoelaces, and not being able to look you in the eye. All of a sudden, the same people who were entirely passive and unable to raise their voice, the very same people a month later are making a revolution. And to me that was a very important lesson, when you realize that ordinary people at the right time, in the right place, in the right circumstances, can make history and can do some wonderful things in terms of altering the way they live. And even though the revolution was crushed by the Russians in '56, it really was a very important event. If you ever have any time, read Hannah Arendt's article on the revolution of 1956. Hannah Arendt, the German-American political philosopher, said it was the most important, or at least one of the most important events of the 20th century. I was also very lucky because I was a young man in the 1960s, and unlike a lot of other people, I'm very happy with the 1960s. I'm not embarrassed about it. It's not something that I think was wrong or bad. For me, the 1960s was crucially important because it created this very brief moment where many of us believed that anything was possible. I know it was foolish, and I know it was crazy to imagine that anything was possible, but if you believe in it for a little while, even for a little while, it pushes you forward far more than if you think that very little is possible. And certainly me and my friends and my comrades who were involved in politics together became, in a sense, much stronger and much more able to discuss and talk and engage with experience. And I'm also very lucky because I live in this present moment. This present moment when most people, most young people I talk to, tell me that on the contrary, nothing is possible. When I talk to my son is 23, he often looks at me in the face and says, "Dad, you were lucky, you could be idealistic. You could be involved in politics, you could believe in something. What can I, in England, in 2018, really believe in? What will be my ideals?" And he kind of looks at me as if it's my fault, or looks at me for answers that I cannot give him. But for me, this is a very interesting period. And the reason why it's very interesting is because whether we like it or not, everything is changing. Everything is uncertain. The political world and the political vocabulary, the political language that we use has irrevocably altered. If you take Europe, if I had a discussion about Europe, about the European Union 10, 20, 25 years ago, I think everybody in the room would realize and would probably agree that the main problem with the European Union is that it lacked legitimacy. In the eyes of most people, the European Union meant very little. People didn't wake up in the morning, brush their teeth and said, "Oh my God, the European Union, how wonderful." That's not how they reacted. They might have been okay with it. They might have felt that this is a useful institution, but it didn't really provoke people's loyalty. Right? It had a big legitimacy problem, which everybody in the European Union recognized, and they discussed it. And they were trying to find ways and means of getting public relations companies to give them some narrative. They've even hired people to give them a narrative for Europe, to make Europe popular. So that's the discussion that you had. Today, the discussion is a bit different. Because not only do you have a legitimacy crisis of the European Union, not only does it lack moral authority in the eyes of most people, what has happened, and it happened very slowly, but today nobody can deny it, is that the mainstream political parties of the post-war European order have unraveled and are gradually becoming, for a lack of a better word, zombie parties. You know, when you look at all the parties from Christian democracy, which were very, very important in 1945, all the way to the communist parties, and in between, you'll find that all those parties have lost belief in themselves, can no longer have conviction. Their members are getting older and older and older. And in many places, they no longer exist. If you go to Italy, you know, look at the absence of Christian democracy, or the PCI. If you go to France, you'll find a very similar story there, where, you know, things are so weird that you literally have a new kind of Bonapartism, with Macron coming along and inventing a new party from nothing, because the old parties are not going to go very far. And in the course of that, what's very interesting, and to me it's very exciting, is you have a lot of new parties emerging. Some of them are on the right, some of them are on the left, some are in between. Most of them are confused. They're at a very early stage of development. But I think in all different ways they can be seen as potentially useful experiments, potentially being able to throw up new ideas. And for me, that's a very interesting development. However, I think there's a number of things that are missing from this, which is something I would like to address. I think the first thing that's missing from this is that people don't talk to each other. I mean, I don't know about Austria, but in England, if you're on the left, you don't talk to anybody that's in the middle or on the right. That's a no-go area. You know, you don't have a debate or a discussion. If you're on the left or on the right, you don't even talk to other left or right-wing people unless they are 100% just like you are. And what we have, and this is amplified by the social media, is a very segmented, very narrow political culture. And that's a problem. And I think the reason why it's a problem is because we know that discussion and debate is really important. I know a lot of people say it's important, but they don't really mean it. But it is really important. The one thing I learned in the last 45, 50 years of my political life is that even when you talk to an idiot, a complete idiot who you don't like, who don't think very much of, and they tell you things that you think are completely wrong, even from that person you can learn. You can learn, at the very least, to understand what makes that person say such idiotic things. Because there's got to be something in life, there's got to be some empirical reason, some experience that makes that person say what they do. And if you listen to it, and if you're open to listening to it, you actually learn from that. And not just me as an individual, but our culture and our society politically move forward. If you look at the 20th century, the left used to influence the liberals, put pressure on the liberals, and therefore the liberals changed because they were getting a lot of pressure from the left. In turn, the liberals put a lot of pressure on the conservatives, so the conservatives were forced to call themselves social conservatives or some kind of, sort of leftish conservative because of that kind of pressure. And they all learned from each other. They wouldn't admit it, but everybody was learning from each other, and our political culture evolved. That's not happening at the moment. At the moment, I think there is a no-go area when we have the discussion. The second problem, this to me is the biggest problem of all, is democracy. Now, democracy is something that everybody says, I believe in. Even in North Korea, they talk about North Korea being a democracy. You don't have people writing, sort of major books that say democracy is an evil. Right? That doesn't exist. Everybody seems to care about democracy, but they don't. I had what I call one of those light bulb moments, light bulb, when it flashes, and suddenly you realize you learned something. Last year, I was doing a debate in Amsterdam in the Valley. I don't know if you know it. It's a cultural institution. And I was debating some Dutch and Belgian people about populism, the subject of populism. And I happen to be one of the few sociology professors that likes populism, and I think that the populist reaction is potentially quite good. It's got problems, but I think it's quite good. Anyways, as we're getting towards the end of the discussion, this guy puts up his hand and says to me, Professor Furedi, are you really saying that democracy is good in and of itself? That democracy is good in and of itself? And I said, well, what do you mean? What do you mean? He says, well, actually, what I mean is that I think that democracy is good if it gets the right results, right? And when he said that, I realized that he was speaking for millions and millions of people in Europe. Because I think most people in Europe love democracy as long as the right person gets elected. They love democracy, as long as it brings the right kind of results. But what happens when democracy kind of creates a problem because the wrong person gets elected? What happens when the people choose somebody who you don't like? Do you then say that democracy is okay on Monday and Tuesday, but not on Wednesday and Thursday? Or what? What do you end up? And I think one of the problems that that I've encountered is I actually do not believe that in Europe the political establishment or most political parties really, really believe in democracy. They don't really understand that it's far better to lose a debate. It's far better to lose a debate than not to have that debate. It's far better to lose an election than not to have that election. In other words, democracy is important for a very simple reason, that it's only through democratic discussion and debate and interaction that there's any possibility of there being potential for any kind of real and genuine solidarity. And that seems to me to be crucially important, especially today, when I think in the 21st century in Europe, a lot of people I know, who don't like so-called populist movements and have become very anti-populist and are complaining about how people are voting for the wrong kind of candidates, are actually, in their anti-populism, are providing what Freud would have called a sublimated expression of anti-democratic sentiments. I mean, that's really what they are saying, and that's what they're doing. And if you don't believe me, and you think I'm just making it up, go to a bookshop, an English-speaking bookshop. I don't know what it's like in a German bookshop. But if you go to an English-speaking bookshop and you go in there, and you go to the non-fiction section, you will find, as I have found, 6 or 7 books that talk about how democracy is a bad thing. You have Jason Bennett writing a book saying, Against Democracy. Sort of other people are saying that democracy has let us down. Jason Bennett argues that to have real, there's no point having democracy because people are not able to be, to make good sense of it. So why not have a situation where if you're educated, if you got a professor like him, he will have 3 votes, right? Because he's a very smart guy, so he should have 3 votes. An ordinary person who never went to university, maybe he and his wife will get 1 vote together, and somebody with a first degree will get 1 vote. So there's an idea, like there used to be in the 19th century, that you have differential votes depending upon your status in society. And those kinds of arguments about democracy being a problem, the arguments you get about democracy are either that most people are too stupid to know the complicated issues that are there. This is an argument used against Brexit, that people who voted for Brexit were really simpletons who didn't know what they were voting for. Or people get easily manipulated by the media, that people haven't got the intelligence to make up their mind and the media just sways them. Or advertisers or public relations people can easily sway them. Or that in a globalized world, the issues are so complex that unless you got a PhD in nuclear physics, you cannot possibly make decisions about any of the complex issues that we have. And all of these are the arguments that are used. when you take and pause for a second, if that's really the case, then of course democracy makes no sense. What's the point of democracy if things are so complex that people cannot be relied upon to vote? And of course, this argument that's being used today is exactly the same argument that first emerged in Athens a few thousand years ago. I don't know how much you know about Greek philosophy, but the interesting thing about Greek philosophy is that books that were against democracy or anti-democratic theory developed before you had books written for democracy. In other words, anti-democratic theory, being against democracy and theorizing about it, people like Plato, precedes attempts to talk about the positive virtues of democracy. And everybody was against democracy. I mean, they were all against democracy, to be honest. I mean, you'll know, for example, that Socrates, in his very famous passage, talks about the people not being able to deal with complexity. He says, look, it's crazy. You know, when I want to build a ship, you know, build a boat for Athens, we get a shipbuilder to build a ship. We don't get her and him to build a ship. That's not their expertise. We know when we want to have a navigator to navigate the ship, to go in the right direction, we get an expert navigator, a ship captain, who's educated. We don't get any idiot of the speed of the Athens to do that. When we want to build a house, you know, we don't get any Athenian to build your house. You get an architect who specializes in doing that. So if we recognize that we need experts for all these different activities, why do we allow anybody to take part in politics? Why not leave it to the political experts? Why do you allow every Athenian who has got no special expertise about public life to determine the future of Athens? And that was the argument that was used at that time. In other words, expertise trumps it. And that's the argument that we're using today. And I think myself that the reason why we have the emergence of all these populist parties, and I hate the name populist, I'm only using it because everybody else uses it, but all these parties, be they right-wing, it isn't because, you know, sort of somehow people voting for these populist parties have become racist or xenophobic or something else. I think the reason why there is this sort of attempt to belittle populism is because, in many respects, one of the things that is being said here is that these people, having got the moral status, the intellectual resources, to be able to deal with the complicated issues that are confronting our society in this globalized world. It's not a different argument than has been used by anti-democrats in the 19th, 18th, 17th centuries, all the way going back to the Greeks. And I think that's important to realize that that's the case. I think myself that paradoxically, the movements that are called populists, the movements that are, in a sense, are trying to find a new voice for themselves, are often a reaction against this. Because one of the tragedies about the European Union is that if you look at it, and this is not just the European Union, it's the political systems of the post-Second World War period, is that they very self-consciously created what we call insulated democracies. These were institutions that were created in a way that will insulate policymakers from pressure. And the way you would insulate policymakers from pressure is by depoliticizing public life. Depoliticizing public life means is that you take out of the realm of politics many, many issues that are then become the sort of the responsibility of experts. You basically take out monetary and financial policy. That's the responsibility of the IMF. That's the responsibility of different sort of European banks and national banks. You have a lot of policies that are being taken out of the public realm, and that's the courts. The courts will decide on certain social and other kind of related matters. You find a whole lot of other issues that you take out. That's technocrats and scientists who are meant to be responsible for that. So when you actually come along, ask, well, what is it that people can decide on, that is a parliamentary decision, it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower. And I think this idea that somehow that so much of public life is beyond politics or is outside of politics, that kind of attitude has become totally institutionalized, particularly since the 1970s. In Europe, the idea that politics is already decided, that you and me have only a minimal choice about what we can do, that idea was most eloquently stated by Margaret Thatcher. I don't know if you know about Margaret Thatcher, the old conservative prime minister of Great Britain. And Margaret Thatcher basically said, there is no alternative. Tina, she called it, there is no alternative. In other words, there is no alternative to her interpretation of what the market was. There simply isn't. Now, if she's actually right, and many people believed, millions of people believed, that, you know, and liberals and conservatives, and even many socialists, people went along with this, that there is no alternative. If there is no alternative, then politics is pointless. And democracy becomes a charade. It becomes a performance. You kind of put something into the box, and into the ballot box, but you know, there is no alternative. And I think that in many respects, the technocratic policies, or what we call technocratic governance of the European Union and the national governments was based upon this idea that there is no alternative. You know, that there is really only a minimal area of choice where you can decide upon whether the road over there, the speed limit is 20 kilometers or 30 kilometers. On the small trivial matters, you can make local choices. But on things that really are crucial, that isn't really there. And I think that kind of depoliticization of people's lives, which came about over the decades and decades and decades, has been really crucially important. And I think that in many respects, it's the depoliticization of public life and the closing down of discussion and debate that came along with it that has ensured that there is a yearning on the part of people to have their voices heard. How much time have I got, by the way?
Please go ahead,
Yeah.
Frank. You're welcome.
I had a very interesting experience a few months ago when I went to Pas-de-Calais in France. And I was particularly interested in talking to the Gilets jaunes, these kind of yellow vest people, who I thought were quite interesting. I'm always a sucker for demonstrations. My wife and I, even though we get very old, every time we hear a demonstration, we want to go on it. It doesn't matter who's doing it. There's something nice about seeing people on the street. So that's kind of my kind of background. So I went to Pas-de-Calais, and I talked to those people, and that was very, very interesting because what I learned from talking to them is they weren't anything like they were described in the newspapers. They weren't anti-Semitic, they weren't racist, they weren't anything that I would see necessarily negative. They were basically people who were a little bit angry, but most importantly what they were, and this is the point they emphasize time and time again, is that they use an expression that I heard a lot in Europe, which is, we would like to be part of the conversation. Right? We would like to be part of the conversation. We would like to be taken seriously. We would like to have our voices expressed somehow. And to me, that made a lot of sense. And the reason why it made a lot of sense is because it related to what is an interlocking problems with democracy, which is solidarity. How do you forge solidarity when people haven't got a voice? And I think it's interesting because Pas-de-Calais, that's the region around Calais in northern France, historically was the stronghold of the PC, of the French Communist Party. It was a fairly left-wing area. And I think if you look at France and if you look at other parts of Europe, you'll find that very often it's in those areas where the left used to be strong, which is now the area that's become relatively populist in terms of their support. I know in my own country, in Hungary, some of the red belt of Budapest, which is a place called, it's gone completely over to the right and to without any kind of thought. And you have similar developments occurring in England, where you find the old Labour heartland is going to be voting for the Brexit party in the coming elections. And I think you have to ask the question why that is. And I think that the reason why that is, it's the legacy of there is no alternative. I think what it has meant, what it has led to is a situation where a lot of people that used to have parties and movements that would speak on their behalf, a lot of people whose parents and grandparents were historically loyal and affiliated with certain kinds of movements, wake up one morning and they basically realize that we haven't even got a party to represent us. There isn't even a party that pretends to speak our voice, right? And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, to me, the extreme example here is Italy. I mean, the fact that Salvini is doing so well, you know, you don't need a PhD in political science to understand why that is. In Italy, the left-wing party, the Payday, the so-called left-wing party, the Payday, if you look at their electoral base, who votes for the Payday? The people that vote for the Payday in Italy are the richest section of Italian society. It's the lawyers, it's the doctors, it's the PhDs, it's the high-ranking public servants and civil servants. The Payday has become, in many respects, the party of the elites of Italian public life. Its support amongst the poorest section of society is fairly limited, fairly weak. Look at the Labour Party where I live in Britain. The Labour Party is very strong in London and, you know, sort of in bits of the south. If you look at the constituencies, you know, where they are getting most of their votes from, they're from the more affluent section of society. And the kind of people that would vote for the Labour Party historically, the old working class communities near Manchester or Birmingham or Liverpool and those kinds of areas, you'll find that those people are increasingly becoming more and more demoralized. They're the ones that are saying, you know, we want somebody else to speak on our behalf. You know, we want somebody to kind of express what we desire to be. And I think, you know, what they're doing at the moment is they're voting for populist movements, as they call them. Some of them are right, some of them are left. I think that they're experimenting, and we need to be able to have a greater sympathy for them. Because I think in many respects, the fact that we have this confused political moment at this stage in time is to do with the fact that everybody in the political spectrum had gone around with the there is no alternative, has gone along with the technocratic governance. And I think that when you have that kind of situation, it's not particularly surprising that the political map of Europe is changing quite a bit. And instead of opposing it and instead of denouncing it, I think it's our job to give that populist sentiment, because that's an honorable sentiment, a populist sentiment. I think it's our job to give that populist sentiment a positive, enlightened, constructive, and even transformative direction. Instead of being afraid of it, you know, we should be able to find ways and means of giving it a more genuine liberal impulse, a genuine more impulse that has a more of a kind of a future-oriented reach. I think we have to do that because the lessons of history is that if we don't do that, then we miss an opportunity. Whenever I have nightmares about the political future, I'm one of those people that one day I have nightmares about the future. The other day I have, wow, this is wonderful. You know, I can't make up my mind. A lot depends upon, you know, sort of circumstances beyond my controls. Whenever I have nightmares about the future, I always go back and I think of Spinoza. Spinoza is one of my favorite philosophers. In many ways, he was the early Enlightenment figure. He probably was, with Pierre Bayle, one of the founders of the Enlightenment, of liberalism, of tolerance. But Spinoza was a very contradictory figure because Spinoza believed in a kind of liberalism, a kind of very individualistic liberalism. But his liberalism and his commitment to democracy was very ambivalent. And I can understand why, because as you probably know, if you know a bit about Dutch history, Spinoza was a very good friend of John de Witt. John de Witt was the head of the Dutch Republic, you know, a very early attempt to create a liberal, secular republic in the case of Amsterdam. And as it turned out in the end, that John de Witt was murdered, brutally murdered and killed by the mobs in Amsterdam who were against this new Republican experiment going on. And for Spinoza, that was like a kind of a shattering experience. And what Spinoza wrote in his book is basically saying, look, the Calvinist mob, egged on by the Calvinist religious leaders, led to the murder of one of the most important products of European political development. You know, that basically tells us that it's almost pointless for me to write to the ordinary person. Right, so when he was writing his books, he was basically saying, I'm writing my books, I'm writing my philosophy for a relatively small select few. There's no point in writing it for ordinary people because they're not going to be able to understand it or appreciate it. And what Spinoza did, because of that negative experience, that horrible negative experience that he felt almost personally, was basically devalue and degrade what democracy meant. And in the course of doing that, also to devalue and have contempt for the demos, for the ordinary people who somehow did not draw the right conclusions and went along the way he wanted to. The reason why I'm saying this is because this is a dilemma that all of us are confronted with. Right? We are confronted with a world that is not of our own making. I love to live in a world that is of my making, but that's not what's happening. A world that's not of our own making. And we're confronted with very messy issues where people are reacting to being sort of isolated from political power and often reacting in ways that is often confused and disoriented, where they basically just react and therefore often come up with often very negative solutions. So what do we do in those circumstances? What I want to suggest we do is we use this as a kind of natural political laboratory, which is there where people are experimenting. And we make an active attempt, an active intervention to ensure that in this yearning for voice, in this yearning for solidarity, we become the ones who are the most democratic, unambiguously democratic, without hesitation, without reservation, without saying that we will qualify our commitment to democracy because if the wrong results come about. And we also become the people that in many respects encourage any demonstrations and any manifestation of solidarity. And I think if we can do that, if we can enter those two arenas with wholehearted commitment, then we can play, I think, a constructive role in revitalizing a democratic, liberalist, future-oriented political culture. I don't know what the name of that will be because at the moment we're very far away from giving the movements of the future a name, and I don't particularly care. What I do care about is that it has that democratic, solidaristic impulse, which is what we need if Europe is going to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for this passionate plea for democracy. Following our usual path, I would now give the word to Professor Renée Schroeder to present her statement, and then we will enter into our discussion. Please, Renée, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank, for a really interesting talk. I agree with many issues you said, but I look at it from a very different perspective. And I would really like to tell you the way I look at the current situation of humanity. And I want to start, I'm going to draw a chart. And what is really interesting is to see the development of humanity, of population. You're probably aware that like 70,000 years ago, the human brain was so far developed that it was able to think of things that don't exist. It became capable of thinking in an abstract way and to invent many, many tools to bypass evolution, to kind of escape evolutionary pressure. That was like 70,000 years ago. But humanity had a big, big struggle. And from that moment on, I think it's the beginning of culture. we were inventing and inventing many things, but we also started to having ideas and writing stories that would socialize people. So we are kind of socialized by stories and ideas, and democracy and the future is one of those. And I want you to see the development of the human growth curve, because I think it's really interesting. Let me get this. So, like 400 years before Christ, like more than 2,000 years ago, there were 300 million people on our planet. This is like minus 400. Then by the year 0, we were still 300 million. By the year 1000, we were like 310 million. And then around the 16th, 17th century, the human population started to grow, got into an exponential phase. So the first billion was the beginning of the 19th century, the second billion, 1960. Now in the year 2007 or 11, we had like 7 million. And now we are at a situation here, this let's say is today. We don't know where it's going to go. It can continue. It can go into a more stationary phase, and it can go into a decay phase. So it's open what is going to happen here. And it's a situation that we haven't encountered yet as a human population. And being a microbiologist and a biochemist, I very often, for 40 years, I was growing bacterial cell cultures. And bacterial cell cultures have a very similar growth. First, they have like a lag phase. Then they go into a log phase where they grow exponentially. Then they go into a stationary phase. And then they go into a decay phase. So the point I want to make here, one has to think, why could the human population not grow for 2,000 years? For 2,000 years, there was no birth. There was no contraceptive pill. But the population couldn't grow. And I think there are many reasons for that historians discuss. So it's infectious diseases, probably. Then the lack of resources to grow enough food. And mainly that's it, right? So what happened around the Middle Age is a discovery that we don't know things. It's the beginning of enlightenment. It's the beginning of the scientific age. Actually, you still have around here the Black Plague. Its population even goes down, right? And then many things happen here. The discovery of bacteria and what science. And we learn how to grow, to build machines. So we were able to grow. But the point I want to make is, what is happening here in a bacterial cell culture? When a bacterial cell culture goes from an amplification phase into a stationary phase, we call it stress. It's a really stress situation because the cell has to turn off many, many, many genes for metabolism and has to turn on a total new set of genes to adapt to this new situation. And it's a stress situation. We call all the molecules that are active around here stress molecules. And I compare the situation of a bacterial cell culture going to a stationary phase to this situation we are now on the planet. So why do they stop growing here? They stop growing because lack of resources, lack of food, but mainly because the medium is full of toxins. So they secrete toxins, so the environment becomes toxic. And we have the same situation at the planet. We are producing too many toxins. And nowadays, our problem is not that we don't have enough food. There are, I think, 3 times more people that have problems of overweight than people that are undernourished. So there is a lot of food around, it's just not well partitioned. But why do I think, and there I'm totally of your opinion, we are in a very, very interesting situation, a very interesting time, because it's a high energy state, if you want. Things are changing, but we don't know how to change. And I don't think that politicians are aware what really needs to be done. I mean, it's not about democracy being left or right, being solidarity or not. What do we have to do as a humanity if you want to survive? The problems are existential. I mean, we should not produce too much toxins. We have to reduce our birth rate, and actually the birth rate is going down since 1960. In 1960 was the peak of population growth, and if it's not going down now, it's because people are getting older. You have to think that in 1900 in Europe, life expectancy was under 40. Now it's over 80. So in 100 years, worldwide, the life expectancy is doubling in 100 years. So it's a huge difference. And I think during an amplification phase, like we had for the last 200-300 years, it's easy to be democratic, it's easy to have solidarity, because things are going better and better, things are optimistic, there is enough resources, everything is growing, but now we have to stop to grow. But everything we know, all the rules we have in our society are kind of built for growth. So we think that more is better. The economy has to grow. This has to get better. So, and now we have to change these rules, and nobody knows where the future is and which kind of rules does our society need to get into a not too stressful situation. And I think we need to go into a stationary phase, and there's nothing wrong about it. It's nothing bad about it. Just we don't know which genes to turn off and which genes to turn on. I mean, in genetics we know, but what are the memes actually in our society that will allow us to go into a stationary phase without going into a catastrophe? And I agree with you that many people want to have their voices, and it's important to make decisions here. And I think one of the essential things that we need is education, and especially education of women. And I had the pleasure to meet Shimon Peres just a few months before he passed away, and he said, only those countries will prosper that educate their women. And there is one example, that's Iran. In the 80s, Iran made a huge effort to educate their women, and their fertility went down from over 5 to just about 2. So if you educate women, the fertility will go down. The fertility is defined as the number of children per woman or per couple. Not the potential children they want to have, they can have, but the number of children they really have. And it's clear that it needs to go down, and there's nothing wrong about it. And I think it's something totally fine, but it's something we should be aware of. And then, for example, if the economy tells us we need to grow, oh, we have only 1% economic growth, that's really bad. Come on. I mean, many of the things we need, we don't really need. So the messages that are going to the population are ambiguous. On one way, we should stop growing, we should stop producing so much toxins, producing so much trash, and poisoning our environment. On the other way, they want us to grow, to have a growing economy, to do even more money and more money. And I really agree with you also, the 60s. For me, the 60s was a time, and I'm really happy that I lived the 60s, we were so optimistic. We didn't have much money. We didn't need much money. It was actually cool not to spend money. But we knew that everything was becoming much better. We were very optimistic, and education was getting better, like in Austria, and everything was so real, and we were optimistic. Nowadays, the situation is much better, in a way. If you look at the statistics, and the world is getting better and better and better, but people don't feel it. The expectations are very, very high. In one way, we didn't have so high materialistic expectations. We had just very other things we just wanted education, we wanted to communicate, we were very excited. Peace was very important. And nowadays, we are, I think, by the economy, incapacitated. So you say infantilized. People are not taken serious. They are told what they should think about. And they are kind of, their needs are artificial. Many of them are artificial. And I think we should think of our real values. What is essential for humanity to survive? And I think that's the point. And it's an important issue. And I'm not sure politicians know exactly what needs to be done. And who are the experts? There are no experts for this type of stressful situation. Although I think, actually, I'm a person, in chemistry, we call this transition state. It's a high energy state. When you have a chemical reaction that has to take place, you have little energy, and then you go into a high energy state, And then here, nothing is defined. It can go to all kind of directions. Many people don't like to be in a high energy transition state. Others like it because everything is open. Things can go in all kind of directions. So I think not everybody likes to be in a high energy state where we don't really know where it's going. But on the other way, it's a big chance. And what I actually would like to discuss is how can we deal with this? One is this education. I think that's really important, education of women. And the other thing, and that maybe, do I have 5 more minutes?
Oh, yes, please.
So I divide the world in 3 pots. This is my philosophy. And these 3 pots I invented according to our creativity. So the pot number 1 contains everything that exists on the universe where humans didn't make any contribution. That's 99.99% of the universe is in pot 1. So this is what we scientists are doing. We are kind of studying pot 1 and filling pot 1. Pot 2 is everything that really exists because we humans thought of it and invented it. And this is mainly our environment, like the table, the microphone, the chat, everything. So it's our creativity, and what we made of it is real, and it really exists because we invented it. But pot number 3 is the pot where the products of the human mind, but things that don't really exist. They only exist in our minds. They don't really exist. Once the brain that thought of it is gone, this thing is also gone. But the power of pot 3 is enormous. For me as an atheist, God is a typical example of a pot 3 device. So it's something that's in people's mind, or heaven, or hell, or paradise, or all kind of things, or maybe idealism, or altruism, all kind of things. Some of them are real, other things are not real. But it's a very powerful pot 3. And that's the problem, that what in modern times we call this pot 3 also fake news. People don't know what belongs to pot 2, 1, or 3. And I think education, in my point of view, is when a person is able to distinguish what goes into pot 1, what goes into pot 2, and what goes into pot 3. What is real and what is not real. And if people learn how to recognize what is essential, what is existential, and what we really need to do, what are facts, it will be much easier to know what decisions to take. But nowadays it's very fashionable, and especially in Austria, there's a lot of esoteric people, a lot of things that have no reality, no value, unless it's in their mind. And this is really a problem. And I think that political parties, they play a lot with this fake news and inventing stories, inventing enemies, inventing things. Also the green parties, the left and the right. It's the politics of fear. You invent something like a danger, and they don't have to do anything against this danger because it's not real anyway. So you keep busy telling people that you're working against this big danger, but it's not real, but it's in the people's mind, and that's the problem. So I think education is the key thing. And the last thing that I want to say is that I think that life has no sense. Sense is also a pot 3 thing. But we need kind of a meaning in our life. So what we need to do is to think of what is meaningful for us. We have to find and to invent the meaning of our life and the sense of life, and not expect other people to tell us what is the meaning of life. And it's something that is very individual. For every individual, it's going to be different what is essential in life, what they want to do with their lives. But I think people want to have the choice and to find what is important for their life. What are they burning for? So that's about it, what I want to say. So I'm actually an optimistic person, but I think it's essential that the right decisions are taken, because we are at a state of humanity where it matters in which direction we go, especially when it comes to climate change. And I really like this movement of these young people, that Fridays for Future, because it's their future, and I think they should be able to make choices what do they want for their future, to find the meaning for their life and their future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renée. I think it is a beautiful opposition that we have here today on the podium. The issue of the social and political issue of democracy and the ecological issue of stopping growth. And also, if we imagine the two political movements that the two of you have mentioned, what would it mean if Fridays for Future would encounter the Yellow Jackets? No? Would there be a possible understanding between these two groups? The one wanting to stop the others driving cars, and the others fighting for their right to and their possibility to drive cars. And maybe, Frank, if I may start with a question that would somehow bring these two aspects together. I would like to know what you think about a sentence that has been uttered by a right-wing intellectual recently in the US, Peter Thiel. He's one of the tycoons of Silicon Valley. And in an interview, he said, there's one fundamental condition for democracy, which is economic growth. And my question would be, do you subscribe to this? Is economic growth the condition for democracy? And is the decline of democracy that we can observe due to the fact that growth of economy has stagnated or is going down?
Well, I don't agree with that. I think that Thiel has got an ideal democracy, which is like a grotesque caricature because it's based upon the market. So a lot of these right-wing business people imagine that the most democratic thing that you can possibly do is when you go and buy something, because in buying something, you're making a choice. So you're buying a Mercedes-Benz instead of an Audi, and that's the kind of choice that they're talking about, which I think has got nothing to do with democracy. And it's just an attempt to basically undermine the distinction between economics and politics. I think the two are very different, and so it's quite important not to do that. I'd just like to go back to what you were saying earlier on. In many ways, if I had a chance to come here again, I would like to do a talk on a lecture that was given in Vienna in 1936, I believe, by Husserl, the phenomenologist. And Husserl gave this lecture. It's a beautiful lecture. I think everybody should read it, which I think is called The Crisis of European Science, or Western Science, and philosophy, or maybe it's the other way around. And in this lecture, what he's really dealing with is this tension between philosophy on the one hand and science on the other hand. And Husserl is the first one to seriously write a critique, which I totally agree with, of what today we call scientism. And scientism basically, to me, means the inappropriate use of science in domains that it's got no place in, particularly in the political domain, where essentially what you have is an attempt to erode. It's a bit like what Thiel does with economics and politics. You erode the distinction sort of between sort of science and the facts and the empirical facts of science with meaning, with the meaning that it has for the human experience. Two are two different things. Facts and understanding what's going on in laboratories for the scientist. Meaning, which is what you were ending on, is ultimately a cultural accomplishment. It's to do with the way that we collectively, as a group in society, are able to endow meaning, human experience with meaning. And I think where I agree with you is I do think that the crisis of meaning is ultimately foundational to politics. The two will go hand in hand, because it's when people are able to give meaning to their lives that they will look for fetishes, and at the moment the fetishes could be to go out shopping. A lot of young girls try to find meaning in their life by cutting themselves. I don't know if you do that in Austria, but we do that in England quite a lot. We have this, without being too critical, proliferation of body kind of tattoos of various sorts. You have this kind of complete fetishization of all kinds of experiences occurring. And one of the things that occurs when we are able to kind of find it difficult to give meaning to life is that things then seem to be an existential problem. And this is where I disagree with you. Because I don't think that, I think whether we describe a problem as existential or not is a product of human choice. I think that, or a human decision about how we, what significance we want to give to that. Because it seems to me that when we call something an existential problem or existential crisis, which is basically it's about human survival, that's what we're talking about, then what we are basically are saying is that the options that we have available to us are fairly limited. And in many ways, I think the reason why today we use the word existential crisis so often about so many different things is precisely because we cannot give meaning to the problems of everyday life in a way that we're able to have a sense of control over it. And I think to gain meaning, a number of things are needed. One is education. I think that's important. But it's not just education. I think it's education that is able to both create a more civilized, a more enlightened sort of population, but it's also the production of knowledge. I think that it's very interesting because we talk about the 21st century as an information society, but information society is not the same thing as a knowledge society. There's lots of information out there, but information is not the same thing as knowledge. Information needs to be converted into knowledge, and I think this is where there's a dialectic between meaning and knowledge. The two things go hand in hand. The more we're able to give meaning to the scientific accomplishments that we acquired, the more that we're also able to produce the kind of knowledge we need to tackle some of the problems that you discussed with. So I'm optimistic because I think that human beings, have always risen to the occasion. I mean, maybe a little bit too slowly for my liking, but they've always been able to come up with solutions to the problems that kind of confront them. And I think that in many respects, despite our political problems, we have become very sensitive to all kinds of difficulties and threats that kind of confront us. So I do think that we need to basically look at this issue of meaning and maybe go back to that 1936 lecture and ask the question how far we've come from there. Because I think if you read that lecture, you will find that it is already talking about the problems that you and I are discussing today, sort of 50, 60, 70 years later.
Okay, thank you very much. Renée, would you like to reply to this immediately?
Yes, there are many points. I don't know where to start. One thing is, it was, I think, a mistake at most universities to separate philosophy from natural sciences, because maybe it was necessary for the sciences to be able to develop, to have this cutting. But I think that we need philosophy to understand and to interpret our scientific data, what it means, because it is knowledge, and this knowledge should be used by as many people as possible, that they understand what it's about. So I think that it would be good to converge philosophy and many disciplines again, and we should have, like the Gilets jaunes talking to the Friday for Future people, I think there should also be the philosophers talking to sociologists, to humanities, and to physicists. They should really increase the dialogue, because I think this is important. Finding yourself. I think the self of a human being is an invention. Everybody can invent your own self. And I think nowadays, with the media, you have many people that have more than one or two or three identities or selves online. You can invent what you want to be. And I think it has never been so easy to invent different selves and have different roles than nowadays. And I think this is really difficult for a young person to find or to invent him or herself. Who are you? This is really the basic question of human culture. Who am I? And there are so many pictures, so many possibilities nowadays. The world is really open for many, many things. And young people have so many influences. There are so many advertisements and fashions and all kind of things. How can young people really find themselves and invent themselves so that they feel that their lives is meaningful and has a sense? I think this is really what is nowadays, I think, way more difficult than when we were young. We didn't have so many choices to decide whom do we want to be, no?
I'm actually writing a book on that particular problem. See, I think the problem is that historically, the sense of self and the sense of identity was bound up with things that you pretty much know what they were. In other words, historically, people didn't have to find their identity. The problem that they had was to live up to their identity that they already knew. Right? It was to realize what they already talked about. It's really in the interwar period that you have the first glimmer of the problem that Renée is talking about. When you have, if you read the novels like Musil in Austria, or if you read, Virginia Woolf in England, where they basically are talking about finding your identity. And it's interesting because the first time that the search for identity is used in the English language is in a novel called Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, in the way that we're talking about it. And the reason for that is because people knew what their identity was, but they weren't sure whether they could, live up to that. Whereas now it's changed, and I think the reason why it's changed isn't simply because of more choice. I think that the choice comes after that. It's because historically your identity was based on something that was pre-given in your society, but more importantly, for young people, their identity was determined by their vocation. They gained their identity from their work, from their kind of career. They gained their identity from their political or philosophical involvement. They're all about long-term durable things. Particularly if you read Erik Erikson, who was the first person to write about finding your identity in that sense, it was work and vocation that was really important. Whereas today, we have a much more passive version of identity, because work is no longer that important in our lives and is not seen to be that important in your life. People in their 20s will change their job 3 or 4 times by the time they get to be 30. So we have a much more passive sense of identity that has developed and evolved over that period of time. So I think that's what the problem is. But I just want to say one thing. These inventions that Renée talks about are inventions, but they're also very real. They're very real because although they're metaphors, they become these instruments through which we give meaning to our experience. So for example, if you take the word conscience, it comes from the Christian tradition, but the Greeks first talked about it. That the conscience, there is no such thing. If you open my body, you will not find Frank's conscience. I think, you can take that out. Even though a lot of people thought there was somewhere in the body a seat of conscience, that's what they were talking about, but there isn't. But nevertheless, there is something there, because everybody in this room knows that something is good and something is bad, something is right and something is wrong. We might have differences on it. We feel guilty. I mean, I'm sure everybody in this room at least felt guilty once in their life about something. So we have something in this inner voice within us. And I think that this, what is a human creation, does then become very real and becomes integral to our humanity. So what we're doing is we're humanizing our nature in all kinds of different ways. And through humanizing our nature, we become, that's what human nature essentially becomes. It's a kind of a process of human beings working on their biological, physical thing, but they become very, very real. And I think that, when we come back to the problem of meaning, I think the problem of meaning today is in part that we're not very comfortable with how we humanize our nature. We're not really sure about all the things that we've done in the past. But we haven't got any alternative, any other kind of answers, and we're kind of looking for solutions in relation to that.
Thank you both. I will now take my devil's role of the host in order to maybe stir up a little bit too much of consensus that has arrived.
We have a lot of consensus. We have to continue this discussion
between the two of you. Because is it not true that there's also a kind of total self-deception of the people going on about their possibilities and what they can change and what they can achieve today? Actually, if we look, for example, at education, no? Of course, and I think this is totally obvious, today people cannot become as much as they could become in the 1970s. Not as many people can study. They are kicked out from the universities after 2 semesters maybe, and in the best case they are kicked out after 6 semesters with a bachelor, and they don't get a substantial study, they don't get a substantial education at the university. There are social barriers, economic barriers. People are wealthy because they inherit money. They don't get wealthy because they work, and they can earn much less due to their work than they can earn due to inheriting. So the amount of money that is inherited today has grown dramatically compared to the amount that people can earn in their lifetime. And also in the political sense, in the 1970s, it was crucial what you voted for or against, and that made a difference, whereas today it makes actually very little difference, at least when it comes to economic policies. No? So it only makes a little bit of difference in terms of what you call pot 3, so a little bit of cultural politics to that wing or a little bit more into the other direction, but it does not make a substantial difference with regard to economic politics and where the world goes. So what do you say about this question to both of you? Is it not true that people have very little hope actually to what they can become, and that there is a kind of neoliberal ideology of flexibility that somehow dazes and confuses them?
Yes. One thing we didn't talk at all about, and that's the stress we have nowadays, is competition. I think in the 60s we had less competition. It just became fashionable to be competitive. But nowadays there's a lot of competition between to get jobs, to get education. And that's exactly the point I was doing. That's my pot 3. All these inventions of the self that people do, it's virtual, it's not real. So you hide in some virtual worlds, and you think you are there, or you're not there. It's irreal, it's virtual. But I think one important issue is the competition that is going on, and that's one thing that I am a bit pessimistic about, that it became fashionable to do competition for competition's sake without thinking if it's meaningful or not. One thing I really hate actually is all these rankings and evaluations of universities, rankings about, because first they preach diversity is important, and I agree that diversity is important, and then they start to make rankings where you have to have the minimal thing that is common to all that you need to make a ranking. So this is total ambiguous. It's I don't know, it's just not the right thing to do. So competition is one thing, and the other thing, this world, I'm thinking this self these are virtual things and not reality. And one point I was doing a lot of research about the self. So when do people actually realize who they are, and how do they get a picture about themselves? So I was thinking, when did actually humans invent mirrors? And this is like maybe 3,000 years ago. So it's not a long time ago that you were able to see yourself. But what is really important is when you look at somebody, you see your self-reflection in the eye of the other. The way you react when you look at me, I see in your face a picture of how you see me, because it's never neutral. And I always wonder why nowadays people don't look at themselves anymore. You go in the bus, you sit in an underground, people don't look at each other. They don't communicate. Because also this eye communication, looking into each other's eyes, is never neutral. And then I was looking in history, when did people start making self-portraits? Because that's the point that people were thinking about themselves, making a picture of yourself. And there is this really, really famous self-portrait from Albrecht Dürer, where he paints himself as Jesus. He makes himself much more beautiful than he really is. And this is like the image of God. And I think this is something very interesting, that in religion you have this, whom do people want to be? And I think this problem, whom we are, is there for a long, long time. I mean, this is not very philosophical, but I think it's part of today's society that people need to know who they are, and it's more and more difficult to find out who you really are.
It's very interesting when you have the first self-portraits, particularly in the Renaissance period. If you look at them, almost every one of these pictures, whether it's a woman or a man, doesn't matter, they will have a book in their hand. Or there'll be a book on the table, or a book by the bed. And that was a signal that they knew how to read. They were educated and cultured and cultivated. The book was a prop that they were kind of using. And I think that, sort of like then, so now we have these kinds of props. And I think you're right, that we know ourselves through the eyes of others. It's the way of the world. And it's very disappointing when you get up in the morning and you say, Frank, I'm such a handsome guy and everything else, until somebody gives me a look in the eye and tells me, no, you're not. So you realize that it doesn't work that way. But I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are about the future. I think that, things are not as bad. So we're actually more educated than we were in the 70s. So I did a book on reading, and in my book, I was concerned with all this pessimism. Everybody's saying that nobody reads anymore. Right? People they haven't got the attention to read anymore. That we live in this hyperactive stage, that published books are going down and everything else. Well, actually, it's not true. I think people, in fact, people read more now than ever before. And not only that, but what's interesting is that people read serious books as well. The point is that the percentage of population of people that read serious books was always a small number. I mean, that was like the case in the 18th, 19th, 20th century. There was a big reading public, but they would read, manuals for fixing your cars or doing your gardens and all the rest of it. Most people did not read serious books, and that's the same thing today. There's a very clear continuity there, but the percentage of people that are reading books is greater, and you can tell that because these days, virtually every small town in Europe has got a literature festival. I mean, I never seen anything like, everywhere you go, there's a literature festival of some sort. There's a lot of people go along to some of those things. So I think with universities as well, you're right, we kick people out too early. But when you think that the large number of people that stay on compared to the past, the number of people that do PhDs. I mean, today doing a PhD is like doing a BA in our days. But there is still a lot of PhD students around. So people are getting educated, and there's a lot of interesting positives going on there. But that's happening in the context that Renée describes so well of a complete, sort of sense of self-annihilation and a kind of very fetishized detachment of yourself from any kind of creative, transformative experience. There's no cultural support for that. And that's why the selfie culture is so important, that there's nothing more desperate than instead of looking at the beautiful mountain, you're taking a picture of yourself, looking at the mountain. It's a kind of different thing altogether. So I think that's what kind of holds us back more than anything else. But when you look around, I think people are traveling more, they're experiencing more, they're thinking more. It's just that at the moment, it's not a generalized kind of phenomenon. And I do think that there's an economic problem, which is, it is sad when your children, are hoping you would die so they will get your house. Sort of that the inheritance acquires such, and it's not as if we're so rich, but compared to what they're earning, it's a lot. So there is that kind of economic stagnation that has occurred. That's been around for a very, very long. People say it began in 2008, but it actually began in the late 70s. Productivity has been stagnant in Europe. And I think there, we do need change. Not growth in a stupid sense, but we do need smart, intelligent technology, which we can bring in. People are often very scared of AI. I think AI is potentially quite wonderful. they're very scared of biotechnology. There's all these scare stories about biotechnology or the use of genetic. I think, sort of all these things are worth, promoting a little bit more, because they can make our life and the human species life much more productive and also potentially much more interesting. And we don't need to have those old industries hovering in the background if we adopt the right kind of strategies. And just finally, I don't want to agree all the time, and I feel very bad about it, but I have learned a very, to my great cost, something very important, which is I'm going to be 72 next month, so I'm a very old man. It took me a long, long, long time to realize how important philosophy is. And if I had to, so that now, even though I'm a sociologist, I almost always read philosophy because I think it is really a foundational discipline. And if I had to do it all over again, which is a stupid thing to say, I would be a philosopher rather than a sociologist, because it does open your eyes in ways that surprises you. And you can never be too old to learn. I mean, that's one of the wonderful things about philosophy. And in particular, you're right about the fact that science and philosophy, which used to be the same, physics in the old Greek area, Greek moment, somehow got separated. And ever since then, we've been separating the disciplines more and more. And I think that part of the restoration of meaning is to bring these disciplines closer together so that we could have, at the very least, amongst intellectuals, a common intellectual language. I mean, I think that's very crucial.
Thank you. Maybe I asked you one question, Frank, that would somehow tackle the issue of the political strategy that follows from what you proposed here before we enter into a public discussion. Because it seems to me that at any moment where you try to develop a kind of political movement, immediately, like 3 people split into 2 parties. And the 2 parties are like a more liberal wing that says, well, we have to unite the educated and liberal people. In Austria, this would mean like trying to seduce the more liberal parts of the conservative parties so that they break the coalition of the right-wing parties and go back into a traditional coalition with the Social Democrats, and so the more liberal-minded people would again get into power, and so on. Same on EU level, no? Let's try to enforce European institutions and enforce integration, and then maybe people will understand how beautiful European Union can be, and so on. And then you have, on the other hand, the wing that says, no, European Union is the problem in itself, and we have to dismantle certain agreements like the Maastricht treatises in order to come back to a kind of substantial Keynesian economic policies, or on the Austrian scale, it would mean that no, we have to form a kind of left-wing movement that would convince the disappointed voters that now vote for the extreme right, and we have to go this more painful and difficult way to bring back the populist votes into a kind of progressive movement. So if these are the 2 alternatives of strategy at the moment, what would you suggest, and how would you suggest to proceed for the wing that you choose?
Well, I think this is the period of experimentation where we're going to try different things out. And I do different things. So, for example, in Hungary, I go back a lot to Hungary. One of the things I'm very interested in doing is talking to young people, 16 to 21, 22-year-olds, because they're still idealistic and they're still open-minded. And I try to talk to them about ideas that they never heard before, because in Hungary, politics is very polarized between the 2 sides. So they don't really, and there's no debate about substantive issues. So in Hungary, one of the things I try to do is to explain to a lot of people who think that they know what liberalism is, or what sort of liberal, genuine kind of Enlightenment ideals are. I try to explain what they really are, and often they're very surprised. And I'm trying to influence a certain political culture there because I think I'm in a very special position coming in from the outside, having had the experience of living in the West. So that's what I do there. In England, I do something very opposite. And it began, the day after Brexit happened, the referendum, I went to my butcher in a small town where I live, and everybody was laughing in the butcher shop. They were very happy. And I said, why are you so happy? He said, well, we voted. This is the first time we voted that it actually meant something. Because usually when we vote, in our place, it's either, we know in advance that it will be either a Labour or Conservative member of Parliament who will get elected, depending on which bit of England. So it's almost pointless to vote. But now, because we voted for Brexit, it really meant something. And they were very, very happy about it. So they asked me, Professor, how did you vote? And I said, actually, to your surprise, I voted for Brexit as well. And they couldn't believe it. They said, people like you don't vote for Brexit, meaning educated and everything else. And I thought that was very, very interesting. So one of the things that I think is important to do is to talk to people like my butcher and people around there, and learn to talk the language of everyday life. I think that's really quite important to use that, because the one thing that I think the experience shows us is that even with the best will, you cannot create a political party from your head, right? You can try, but it will be the three of us, and maybe two will come for a few months as well. You cannot create a political party in your head. The real movements emerge out of reality. It's always been the case that something happens in the world, and it creates a demand for answers, and it creates a demand for new voices. And I think that's what's happening now. And I think the strategy that's, the tactic has got to be one of trying to engage with something that is happening in the world, answering the questions that people are asking, and maybe find new ways of posing politics in relation to what people are talking about. And I think it's different in different circumstances. I don't think there's a same answer in every bit of Europe, because the cultural and the political context are really very different. And the problems of people living in the provinces is very different than the urban kind of generation. So that's the line along which I'm thinking. And for me, I think living in Britain at the moment with the possibility of what's happening now, it is very, very interesting. Everybody, ordinary people, are talking about we need new parties, right? They're doing it from the Greens on that side to the far right, and we need new parties. And I think that indicates that something is happening in the air, and we have to find a way of finding what it is in the energy that can take us in a positive direction. And there's always a positive element to that, and we just got to be able to harness that and use it in an effective way. So that's how I'm thinking at the moment. And it's different in different bits. I think in Austria, if I was in Austria, I'm sure I would be doing something a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. Just because you made us curious now, would you tell us the reason
Yes.
why you voted for Brexit?
I wanted to ask the same thing. Why did you vote for Brexit?
Well, basically with democracy, I think that a lot of people believe that the EU, the way that it works in Britain, sort of creates an unaccountable system where a lot of decisions that are made that affect people's lives are taken out of the public political arena. And I love Europe. I mean, I'm not even English. I'm not even British.
Are you Hungarian?
I'm Hungarian, but
Would you have to go back to Hungary then?
I wouldn't. I don't think that's a myth that any of that would occur. But I'm also live in Italy. I speak French. I've got friends, all over Europe. So I'm not against Europe. I'm against the European Union's political system, and I would like to see that changed and reformed, so we can create the basis for a genuine European coming together rather than the way it's constructed now. And I think that for me, Brexit was a really good opportunity and for arguing about democracy. And myself, I also said, if we're going to get rid of the European Union, then we also need to get rid of the House of Lords, which is, I don't know if you know what the House of Lords is, the second tier in the Parliament, which is unelected. And also, it's not really good that in the 21st century we still have a monarchy that's got important powers, because they're all part of the, they're all very, very similar. So
Great Britain will also decay. Scotland will be separated from
I don't know if that will happen because
That would be the same line, right?
If-
Making
well,
little
if-
regions.
if Scotland genuinely wants to be independent, then they have the right to be independent.
They wanted to be a member of the EU, right?
Well, good luck to them. You know, so, you know, sort of. I think that even in Scotland there was a substantial Brexit vote there as well. It's
The question is, they prefer Brussels or London?
yeah. I think that's the question. I think they'll. It depends on what happens, but I think they will choose London. But if they choose Brussels, well, that's their decision. You know, sort of.
Okay, are there any questions from your side, or is exhaustion of attention already proceeded to the extent? Sir, please.
I think we should also take in consideration that all the European countries that you mentioned are former monarchies or anything like that have only known democracy for 100, 110 or 150 years. When you look at Switzerland, where they have democracy for 800 years, I think that the risk of small populist parties and things like that is minimal, because they are much better educated in democracy. They make reasonable decisions, usually, one way or the other. You can agree or not, but I think that is something that we could learn from the Swiss in transferring that democratic tradition into the rest of Europe. The second thing I would like to stress is that when I listen to you, we think of a small minority of well-educated reading people. You said it yourself. I think there is an enormous amount of people that they never think about who they are. They just are what they are. They don't have the option. If you grow up as the son of a carpenter in Eastern Tyrol, you will be a carpenter in Eastern Tyrol for the rest of your life, and you can choose if you want farmer's girl from the left or farmer's girl from the right. And you grow up with a bank, and you grow up with your fire brigade and all that stuff, and make music. There's an enormous amount of people all over Europe that live in such a tradition, and they usually get forgotten in our discussions about how to make the world better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is especially the second point, it's crucial. It tackles the issue of what is now often described as the people who are the anywheres, who are able to live in Paris as well as in London, in Vienna or in Stockholm, against the people who are the somewheres, who live in some place, I don't know, like Amstetten or whatever, and would not move to, I don't know, Ypres or some other small village. And I think it is important to recall that this is an issue of conflict also today. But of course, the question was addressed to you.
Yeah, I mean that's precisely what I'm trying to address at the moment, because if you take Hungary, for example, people who criticize Hungary often say wrongly, as it happens, it's very anti-Semitic. I don't think it is. You talk about the Roma people. I think there's a problem there with the Roma people. That's true. And they do that because they what I call very sexy issues in Europe. I mean, identity politics is very minority-related issues, very, very, sort of fashionable. What they don't talk about is there's about 1.5 million Hungarians living in the east part of the country in real poverty. I mean, they really are living in very poor conditions. And historically, there would have been the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, or somebody would have spoken up for them, given them a voice. Nobody cares about them. The opposition to the government has forgotten them completely. And so they are genuinely a forgotten people. And I think that's what you find all over Europe. There are people who have been forgotten or who are not taken seriously. And I think that it's our job to, that's what I like, that's one of the reasons why I like populism. Because genuine populism, the way it arose historically, was really about trying to sort of address people of this sort, to to find ways and means of ensuring that they had a dignified life and an existence where they were taken seriously just like anybody else, like a university educated or other kind of individual. And I think that when you look all over Europe, we are finding that these groups of individuals exist everywhere, and they are just simply left out of the calculation. And when they open their mouth, we make fun of them. And in the Hungarian language, the Budapest intellectual uses these words. So there's a Hungarian word called proli, which is a short for proletarian, but it's a word of contempt. And they use the word peasant, not in the neutral sense of some of the peasant is a peasant, a lower life, kind of. They do the same thing in Italy. When I was at a dinner party in Milan recently with some academics, the way they were talking about ordinary people, the ones that voted for Salvini, it's almost as if they were animals. I mean, it's a kind of lower form of human beings. So there is something very important here for us to tackle, because I think it's our responsibility to bring, to somehow speak up for these people and find ways and means of giving them a genuine role as citizens. And the one thing we didn't talk about at all today is citizenship, which I think is a crucial issue here. It's very important in Switzerland. Being a citizen really means something special. I think citizenship ought to be something that's at the center of our political strategy. Being a citizen has duties and responsibilities that we want to educate our young people to take seriously.
Okay, we have another question here.
This is directed at Frank Furedi again. I tend to listen to podcasts of Spike, so I've got a kind of idea about the background in which you're arguing with what people you're debating. Now, what I like very much about the work that you do, and what I found also in how you were giving your presentation, is that you maintain a sympathy for working class communities, you maintain a sympathy for ordinary life, for getting on in life, for doing a job, for having a common sense approach to life, having a lot of respect for people if they're not academics. So this is what I like very much, and I think that's kind of class politics like it was in the 60s and 70s transformed to modern times. So this is something that goes down very well, and I'm fully aware that when you attack things that are quite common sense in this left-wing liberal audiences, usually you do it from a perspective of defending ordinary people and their culture and their lifestyles. So this is what I like about it, and I hope I understood you correct that somehow you stand by the people that in former times Marxists were standing on their side. So this is maintaining the same friendships like they always were. Now, the trouble, I will have two arguments now. The trouble is that there is a change going on since 30 years. And the second thing that I would like to mention is we're in Austria. The trouble. Now, there was a nice thing till the 70s, maybe 80s, that when we spoke about, and we came from working class communities, and we spoke about socialism, we had the same interest that people who wanted respect for their communities were arguing for equality. They were arguing for equality because they saw progress for themselves in an equal society. If I stand for equality between humans, I get health care. If I stand for equality for humans, I get progressive taxation. If I stand for equality between humans, I will have a better life for my children in the education system. So we had the ideals of equality, ideas of enlightenment, strongly linked to working class communities, or not working communities. This was the ideal of equality. Very deep-sitting ideal of equality was linked to this. Then we had changes in the international economy. We had changes that, to a certain extent, reduced the capability of trade unions and the labor movement to make changes, to a certain extent. I don't agree that we didn't have much progress in that period. If you simply look, the average Austrian works 300 hours less per year than the average American, both in capitalism, so different possibilities exist. We've got a different housing market in Vienna than you have in London. Possibilities exist, but people don't see anymore, like all of you were arguing, and I agree with that by casting a vote, the difference that I make gets less. So I understand that from an ordinary point of view, I don't see much point, or less and less point, to vote for left-wing parties in elections, because the perceived difference is not as obvious again. And somehow, to a certain extent, really the difference isn't that big anymore like it was in the 70s. Now, the very logical explanation now is, so if I want to maintain my share in this welfare state, I can't achieve it anymore at the expense of mobile labor, so at least I defend it against others who want to have a share in our welfare system now. That's not irrational, that's straightforward, but it's a logic that has morally, of course, not the thing that I want to support. But I have to have respect for that position in the first place, because actually it's not stupid, it's not irrational, it's logic. I can't improve the living conditions for myself and my children anymore at the expense of the upper class, so at least I don't share it. I don't like it, but it's not irrational. Good. So it brings me to the point that when I want to stand by the people who are less well off in society, it's not irrational that I should have respect for a kind of closed border point of view, which is disturbing. Third, I think you're more relaxed about populist movements in Great Britain because you have defeated fascism. You're in a country where we're less relaxed about populism movement because fascism has defeated us. And that's an essential problem that makes us not at all laid back on this. As our populism was a populism that is growing out of a soil that managed to go to the most barbaric system that ever existed. So these are the three arguments. I have loads of respect for the point of view, for the position on classes that you hold. Secondly, I see it as a major decision to be taken as it's broken the link between the poorer people have the better morals, better, whatever that means. And thirdly, we have not defeated fascism.
Please, Frank.
Well, I could spend hours answering the questions because they're very, very interesting questions and very difficult ones to answer. Just on the last one I think it's important that we are very careful how we use the word fascism, because I think it's had a historically specific context and a very unique destructive force that we often use very loosely now. For example, in England, a Labour politician called Nigel Farage, a Nazi, which I just think is, means that he doesn't know what Nazis are. And it trivializes Nazism, but also debases political language quite a bit. So we've got to be a bit careful now. I'm not relaxed about fascism. I mean, for a start, I lost most of my family in the Holocaust camps. So I know that it's got very destructive, negative consequences to it. And something that, I know it was a major problem. But what I do want to argue is that the problems that we're confronted with today shouldn't just be seen as a premonition of a return of fascism. I think there's a danger at the moment that every time anybody says something that's nationalistic, or somebody said Austria first or whatever, it's immediately seen as a slippery slope towards Kristallnacht. Somehow it's going to have that kind of effect. And that kind of collapses the meanings of what's really going on there. And so I don't think we should be relaxed about it, but I think we should have a reality check. And I think very often, if you have a reality check, then we can understand that what's really going on here is what you describe, which is that, the meaning, a lot of people feel that the meaning of being an Austrian citizen or a French citizen has diminished if people come into your country have got the same rights as you have, right? And there's some logic in that, because historically, what we can believe in the morality of human equality, which I think is a legitimate point of view, that all human beings are morally equal, whilst at the same time recognize that politically, not morally, but politically, people have very particular duties and responsibilities. And they are often quite specific, and the tension that we have is how you kind of bring it together. Now, the problem that we have in Europe is that immigration has been a very big factor, and there's nothing wrong with immigration, nothing wrong with immigrants coming in whatsoever. And I've always been historically somebody that is in favor of very generous immigration policies, there's a problem when immigration occurs in a way that's top-down, where people are never consulted or never asked, well, what do you think? You know, sort of, do you think it's a good idea? What's your opinion on this? And that's very important because, immigration isn't just people coming in. Immigration alters your life in a very kind of fundamental sense. Your community, your way of life will never be the same after that, especially when you have not individual immigration, but mass immigration, as is the case at the moment. So in that sense, people have a very, as you indicate, some very real questions that you have to respect. And the one way of respecting it is not necessarily by agreeing with it, but by debating it and discussing it. And not do what we do in England, where every time somebody says, well, let's talk about immigration, people say you're a racist, you're a fascist, not react in that kind of a way, but to kind of draw that out and have a serious kind of proper discussion about it. So I do think that these are kind of very difficult issues, but they've come about partially because, as you were implying, the difference between the left and the right is meaningless. I mean, I hate giving personal stories, but this is the story that I tell everybody that I talk to. 7 years ago, my son at breakfast asked me, Dad, are we left-wing or right-wing? Right? Now, I never asked my father that, are we left? I knew what I was. But the fact that he asked that, he's not a stupid boy, he's not an idiot. The fact that he asked that question indicated that things were very confusing for him because of the way of what left and right means. And I think that, this is part of the problem that we have. The old political vocabulary, is emptied of meaning in many cases. And the language you use is very interesting. You talk about the old school left wing, because that indicates what it used to be like, which by definition isn't like what the new school left wing is, sort of, because in Europe, the new school left wing is really about identity politics. I mean, that's really its distinguished kind of feature rather than anything else. And we also know that historically identity politics used to be the monopoly of right-wing conservatives in Germany in the 19th century. So it does become very confusing under those circumstances. And all that we can do is kind of look around and work out for ourselves in an honest way what's the best way of kind of proceeding. And I think that, I think that in Austria you can be relaxed about fascism at the moment, because if you're uptight about fascism, you will not see what's really going on there. It becomes too much. It will kind of close your eyes to what is really being said, and people will react almost viscerally and think that everything that's horrible is really a symptom of what happened in the 30s, sort of. And I think there are many other things that are horrible that can happen that's very, very different, and we have to be sensitive to that.
Okay, I have the awful duty to close this session now due to time limits. Thank you, both of our guests tonight. Thank you very much, Renée Schroeder. Thank you very much, Frank Furedi. And thank you, the audience, for the brilliant questions and for your attention and for your interest. And if you can, please come back next week to our talk with Chantal Mouffe in Vienna, 4th of May. Thank you very much.